Hi everyone. I wanted to talk to you about how to format in-text citation. First of all though, I wanted to remind you that when you introduce an author in your essay, you always ought to introduce him or her by full name first, before you refer to him or her by last name only. So in this example, we're imagining that the author has not been introduced beforehand, and the in-text citation would then include the author's name and page number. However, if we do introduce the author beforehand, as in this case, we do not need her last name in the citation, just the page number, because she's already been introduced right beforehand and it is clear who stated the quote. A good way to help you understand what information goes in the in-text citation is to understand the works cited page. Here's a list of the elements that go in a works cited entry, and this is in order. So you can see each piece of punctuation as the piece of punctuation you would include in a works cited entry after that particular element. However, if you do not have access to some of these elements, you of course would not include them. You only include the elements you do have. Normally you're listing the author first here, but what if you don't have an author? When there's an unknown author, then you just go to the next element on the list. In this case, the title of the source is the next element that this writer has to include, and that is the name of an article. So notice that when it comes to citing that, when there is a quote in your essay that needs to refer to this, you would put the quote here, and if you have not introduced this article beforehand, all you need is that first word put into the citation. You don't need to include the entire title of the article. You just need that first word or a couple words to indicate to readers which works cited entry you're referring to. Notice that on the works cited page, normally the first line of a works cited entry juts out to the left and the other lines are indented. This is so readers can easily go down to the works cited page and see that first bit of information that lines up with the citation and find it more easily. So next, what if there is no page number? This happens often when you're quoting from perhaps a web page where there are no page numbers. And in that case, you can't make up page numbers. So here's what you do. You'd look again at the works cited entry. In this case, we do have an author. We have the title of an article. Now, if you do introduce that author, that first piece of information first, there is no information to put into the in-text citation since there is not a page number. So in that case, as long as that first bit of information is introduced first, there is no in-text citation because you do not have access to a page number. Another way it can look is like this. So if you did not introduce the author first and you include a quote, you would put that first bit of information in the citation, which is Clancy. Again, no page number because you do not have access to that information. So in this first case, it's actually a situation where no in-text citation would be used, which seems really unnatural, but that is the way it goes in that scenario. Now, what about if you're citing texts from different authors? Here we start out introducing Kathleen Blake Yancey by her full name, and then we don't need her last name in these citations. We just need the page number because we've already introduced her here. However, in the second paragraph, there's a quote by Gerald Campano. He's been introduced. We don't need his last name in the citation because it's clear that he said it. But in the third paragraph, we go back to Yancey. She's not reintroduced. So in this case, we do need to put her last name in the citation to make it clear who this quote came from. And this is the whole purpose of in-text citation, is this clarity for readers so that they know exactly who is speaking and that they can go to the works cited page and find that entry. Now, what about if you're quoting from a book with multiple authors? In this case, Gerald Graff wrote a book where multiple authors helped him with it. But even though you can find the names of those authors in the book itself, for the works cited entry, you just add et al., and that represents the fact that multiple authors wrote the book. This would translate over to your in-text citation. If you are quoting from that book, you would put Graf et al. And the page number, and that would show that it's from Graf's book with multiple authors. So next, let's ask if you're quoting from an article or story within a collection. That can change things. So again, Gerald Graf's book, They Say, I Say, has an article inside it by another author, Sean Blanda. There's also examples of this, say, in an anthology, where it's a collection of short stories written by other people. So in this instance, this is the way it would get cited. Here's the works cited entry for that. The author of the article inside this book is Sean Blanda, so his name comes first and the title of his article. The book where this comes from is represented here, so we know that it comes from this book. Outside, it's not Blanda's book, but the article is Blanda's. And in the citation, since Blanda is not introduced ahead, we're assuming, his name comes in the citation, not Graf's. We know it comes from Graf's book, but Blanda is the one who gets the credit in the citation. Now, what if you're citing an indirect quote? This is when an author who wrote a book is citing somebody else's quote within his work. In Graf's book, he quotes George Orwell. So there's a couple ways you can do this correctly. You could note the information beforehand. Talk about Gerald Graf's book, that he's quoting Orwell in this article, and in that case you just need the page number. But if you did not include that information beforehand, you'd want to signify in your citation that this is being quoted by Graf from somebody else. And to do that, you put quoted in Graf et al. 22. So that's signifying that this quote is not Graf's, but somebody else whom he's quoting. Another type of citation that comes up is based on time-based media. There's a lot of this out there. There's films, videos, podcasts, and you can see here's an example of a works cited entry for a YouTube video. But if you are taking a quote and citing a quote from a video or a podcast, you'd want to include the timestamp within the citation. So again, it would depend whether or not the person who said it is introduced beforehand in your essay. You might need that last name in here based on the information we've looked at before. But you also want to include this timestamp, which represents the beginning of the quote to the end of the quote, that time period. Next, I want to show you block quotes. Now, block quotes are when you have 4 lines or more of text, a quoted text in your essay. And notice that these are indented evenly in. There are no quotation marks in block quotes because the indentation itself represents the quote marks, so you do not need it. In addition, instead of the punctuation going at the end of the citation like we see in regular in-text citation, the period goes at the end of the citation and not at the end of the quote. But in a block quote, it's the opposite. The period goes at the end of the quote with the citation outside. So let's review this. First of all, what do you have to do before you can refer to an author by last name only? You have to introduce the author by full name beforehand. Number 2, if you introduce the author beforehand, do you need his last name in the citation? You only need the page number, as long as other authors have not intervened with their quotes. If the author is introduced right before, you only need the page number in the citation. Now, number 3, what information do you use in the citation if your source has no known author? In that case, you're going to use the first information in the works cited list. In this case, it's that first word of the article that gets included. Number 4, what information do you use if your source has no page numbers? In this case, you might not need any citation at all if this information is introduced before. If it's not, you can use again that first information in the works cited list, which might be the author's name, but you do not need a page number since you do not have access to that information. Number 5, what information do you add if your source has multiple authors? You want to add this suffix et al. Onto the end, and that signifies multiple authors have written that book. Number 6, what information do you use if you're citing an article or story included in a larger source like an anthology or a collection? So here you want to credit the person who wrote the actual article that you're quoting from or story, and the information about which book it is in is here in the works cited. However, in the citation, it represents the actual author who stated the quote. For an indirect quote, when someone's just talking about a quote from somebody else in their own text, you can do it a couple ways. If the information is introduced before, you just need the page number. But if it's not, you want to make sure that this is not actually the author saying it, in this case Graf, but that he's quoting somebody else's words. So you say quoted in Graf. Number 8, what information might you include for a quote from a film, podcast, or video? In this case, you want to add perhaps the author if you haven't introduced them first, in addition to the timestamp, which represents the area of the video your quote is in. Number 9, what if you cite quotes from different authors moving back and forth between their words? In this case, you always want readers to be clear about who is quoting or who is being quoted. So if you switch back and forth, you might have to clarify that last name in the citation if you haven't reintroduced the author. And then finally, how is formatting different for block quotes? Here we have that indentation for quotes that are 4 lines or longer. The period goes after the quote instead of after the citation, like in normal in-text citation. And then we have our citation at the end. So I know this is a lot of information to take in, but I hope it helps you as you work on formatting these different types of in-text citation. I'll talk to you later.